10 years after the Wright brothers flew their first airplane, a new kind of aircraft was developed that would dominate commercial and military aviation for the next 4 decades. The flying boat. Brainchild of aviation pioneer Glenn Curtiss. It is an American legend that has come and gone. Born at a time when only water could support large aircraft. By the second decade of powered flight, flying boats had become the first airliners, the first American airplanes to engage in combat, and the first to conquer the Atlantic Ocean by air. The freedom of flight is like no other. For any pilot, gazing at the ground that passes far below is a liberating experience, as it was for the pioneers of powered flight nearly a century ago, when they first conquered the air. But what goes up must come down. While the space above the ground is limitless, a suitable surface on which to land is not. Today, there are pilots who say there is only one type of aircraft that still captures the true freedom of flight: the seaplane. Free of fixed airstrips, it can fly to some of the most remote parts of the world. For as long as there's water, there's a runway. This is Keuka Lake, one of the smaller Finger Lakes in upstate New York. Over 80 years ago, a type of seaplane was developed here on these waters that would dominate the first 5 decades of powered flight. The term seaplane generally refers to any aircraft that operates off water. The commonly seen float plane is basically a land plane fixed with pontoons instead of wheels. It is practically the last vestige of water-based aircraft. Only a distant reflection of its larger brother, the flying boat. Unlike the float plane, the flying boat's hull rests directly in the water. These large seaplanes were the mainstay of both military and commercial aviation up until the end of World War II. Some of the best known and best loved aircraft were flying boats, including the famous China Clipper. Today, these classics are all but extinct. But in their day, they were among the most technically advanced aircraft, offering size and range unmatched by any land plane, thanks to the energetic, innovative mind of one of the greatest pioneers of aviation, Glenn Hammond Curtiss. Second only to the Wright brothers in the annals of aviation, Glenn Curtiss was a genius in his own right. Self-taught aeronautical engineer, Curtiss established many firsts in aviation. He was truly a small-town American hero. Born in 1878 in Hammondsport, New York, Curtiss developed an early love for bicycles. As a teenager, he would bike up and down the hills around Hammondsport, developing his muscles to the point where he began entering in races and winning. At age 20, he opened his own bicycle shop, and it was not long before he adapted gas-powered engines to his bicycles. They said Glenn was addicted to speed. In 1907, he earned the title of the fastest man on Earth after setting a motorcycle speed record of 136 miles per hour. The Curtiss name was becoming synonymous with superior engineering. Meanwhile, a different kind of machine had made history some 3 years earlier. The Wright brothers had become the first to successfully fly a mechanically powered airplane. But their obsessive secrecy in its continued development led many Americans at the time to doubt the authenticity of their claims. Famous for his motorcycle engines, Glenn Curtiss had attracted the attention of the famous Dr. Alexander Graham Bell and was asked to join a group called the Aerial Experiment Association. The 5 members, guided by Dr. Bell, set out to study the mechanics of flight, whereby each member would design and fly his own airplane. Curtiss was selected as Director of Experiments, and the machines were to be built at his plant in Hammondsport. The first 2 aircraft were successfully flown over short distances, but the Curtiss-designed aircraft clearly outshined the rest. The Junebug, as it was called, performed so well that the AEA elected to try for the Scientific American Trophy, which had been offered for the first public flight over a distance of 1 kilometer or more. On July 4, 1908, Curtiss flew his Junebug a distance of over 5,000 feet, well beyond the kilometer required to capture the trophy. The crowd of newsmen, scientists, and officials had witnessed the flight. It was now on record. In the public's mind, man could truly fly. From that point on, the quiet man who loved to tinker would be forever associated with the advance of aviation. Hammondsport sits at the edge of Keuka Lake in the heart of New York wine country. In the fall of 1908, Curtiss removed the wheels of his Junebug and replaced them with 2 canoe-like floats. To the other members of the AEA, his intentions were clear.
If you look at this valley where they're experimenting, they're relatively small fields. They had to fly over some rather forbidding country, including vineyards. And if you've seen vineyards from the air, you know it's an inhospitable surface. And I know Curtiss had to fly over this. So I think when he compared what they were flying over and wanting to continue experimenting, that's why he wanted to see if they couldn't possibly fly off water. Another thing, as aviation developed, there were very few flying fields, but there were lots of lakes.
It was completely logical. Keuka Lake offered a calm, smooth surface and a relatively unlimited runway. The loon, as it was called, sat catamaran style in the water. It proved perfectly capable of speeding across the lake surface, but refused to get airborne. A stronger engine was installed, but still no liftoff. The flat bottoms of the triangular floats could not break the suction of the calm lake surface. After a float was damaged in testing, further development of a water-based aircraft was soon shelved, but not forgotten. The notion of water-basing an airplane was nothing new. As early as 1905, French aviation pioneers Gabriel Voisin and Louis Blériot had experimented with seaplane gliders on the River Seine. And in 1910, the French marine engineer Henri Fabre became the first to successfully take off and land on water in an airplane. Insufficient funds grounded any further development, but Fabre went on to manufacture floats for future aircraft, such as this Voisin amphibian. Meanwhile, the international community was buzzing over the most dazzling display of aircraft yet seen. In 1909, the first international air meet was held in Reims, France. Over 200,000 people watched as the young American Glenn Curtiss bested the finest aviators Europe had to offer. His latest aircraft, aptly called the Reims Flyer, was powered by an 8-cylinder 51-horsepower engine. Upon takeoff, Curtiss impressed everyone with his speed, 47 miles per hour. Beating Louis Blériot by 40 seconds, Curtiss captured the Gordon Bennett Trophy and impressed the world. The hero of Hammondsport had clearly become an international sensation. Back home, the airplane had finally been recognized for its military value. At Fort Myer, Virginia, The Wright brothers demonstrated their improved aircraft to the U.S. Army in September of 1908. 2 U.S. naval officers witnessed the demonstration. Surely, they thought the Navy must acquire its own aircraft. But the Navy was not ready to accept the new concept. Within 3 years, however, it would have its first aircraft and open a naval air facility in a small town of central New York, Hammondsport. By late 1910, Glenn Curtiss persuades the U.S. Navy to allow one of his exhibition pilots to take off from a wooden deck mounted on the bow of the USS Birmingham. 2 months later, on January 18, 1911, the same pilot, Eugene Ely, lands the Curtiss pusher on a platform erected over the stern of the USS Pennsylvania. Surely the Secretary of the Navy cannot ignore the implications of these remarkable demonstrations. But in fact, the Secretary states that such a capability has little practical application for a surface Navy. Still unable to pique the Navy's interest in aviation, Curtiss tries a different approach. He will offer to instruct a naval officer free of charge in the operation and construction of his aircraft. The Navy sends Lieutenant Theodore Spuds Ellison to North Island at San Diego, California, the site of Curtiss's new winter facility. Ellison is a fast learner, but his keen interest in flying lessons soon turns to Curtiss's latest project, an aircraft that operates off water. Amid the flat, sandy beaches of North Island, the 2 men begin working together to solve the problems associated with getting airborne from the water. Finally, success. On January 26, 1911, the hydro-aeroplane, as it is called, leaves the water, flies a short distance, and lands. They found the optimal float design, one single planing float with an upturned lip, 12 feet long by 2 feet wide. For the next month, they perfect the overall design until Curtiss is ready to make one last pitch to the Navy. On February 17th, Curtiss contacts the captain of the USS Pennsylvania, anchored in San Diego Bay. This is the same ship used for the spectacular landing and takeoff the previous month. Since then, the Secretary of the Navy has indicated that until an aircraft can be lowered over the side by a ship's crane, take off, and then return alongside to be hoisted aboard, no official consideration will be given toward naval aviation. Before the very eyes of the commander and crew, Curtiss lands his aircraft along the ship's side, engages the crane hook to a sling he fashioned earlier, and rides on the top wing as it is hoisted aboard. After a brief visit, the process is reversed. Curtiss has satisfied all the Secretary's requirements. The Navy will have its first aircraft. In July of 1911, the Navy accepted the first of 2 hydro-aeroplanes ordered earlier that May. It also acquired a new pilot, Lieutenant John H. Towers. He would begin training under Ellison and later become one of the Navy's most important aviators. Hammondsport soon evolved into a small naval air facility. As young Navy men learned the art of flying from Curtiss, the local residents became familiar with the strange machine buzzing above Keuka Lake. With the success of the hydro-aeroplane, Curtiss was ready to move on to the next step in the evolution of waterborne aircraft, a machine that was as seaworthy as it was airworthy. What would aptly be called the flying boat.
They felt that it was a more practical configuration, and they started working, really it developed itself because they started working with putting a shield around the hull of the hydroplane, and then they built a pretty flat boat and put the tail on the stern of it. And within less than a year and a half, it evolved into a true flying boat. And It was more sturdy, more rugged, and a more practical arrangement.
The flying boat was quite literally that, a boat that flies. The main body, or hull, was designed to withstand the pounding associated with taking off and landing on water. The single engine, a pusher type like that of the hydroaeroplane, was positioned between the two wings, the tips of which were fitted with small canister-like floats. The first successful flying boat flew at Hammondsport in July of 1912, but not before Curtiss had to solve one major problem. The flat-bottomed hull refused to leave the water's surface. The old problem of suction that had once kept the loon from getting airborne had returned. After closely watching the hull's attitude and the flow of water at various speeds, Curtiss fastened two wedge-shaped blocks to the hull's bottom. The next attempted takeoff was a howling success. The wooden blocks had created a break in the flat bottom, thus releasing the craft from the water's surface. The step, as it was called, would be patented by Curtiss in 1915 and would be configured into every flying boat hull constructed from that moment onward. Compared to the hydroaeroplane, the flying boat was superior in size, speed, range, and durability. The Navy promptly ordered 5 of them. At the same time, Curtiss started promoting his new machine for the commercial market. Courting the American sportsman, he advertised his flying boat as the Aero Yacht and began attracting wealthy customers.
He enjoyed flying himself, and I think he always envisioned that aircraft would be a sporting thing, a field of sportsmen. And he sold the first 2 or 3 to people like McCormick and Vilas, and they flew it for fun. They weren't professionals, they just were flying for fun. McCormick flew it back and forth from his summer home to his office in Chicago. And the exhibition teams would go out with the flying boats, and they would fly at different yacht clubs.
Priced at $6,000 apiece, the Aero Yacht was an expensive item in those days. But wealthy sportsmen fell in love with these handsome new flying machines and snapped them up as weekend toys. They even ordered them custom-made at no small cost. Demand mushroomed rapidly, boosting production and new advertising. Some of these new customers became well-known and skilled pilots and raised much publicity for the Curtiss flying boat. The new Curtiss machine was also a hit on the international market. Buyers included the British, Russian, and Japanese governments. Curtiss was also running flight instruction schools in San Diego, Miami, and at home in Hammondsport. The small town became a new hotspot for budding aviators, eager to learn from Curtiss himself. Life was good. The world was indeed beating a path to his door, demanding flight instruction and purchasing Curtiss airplanes and flying boats. And within 2 years, Glenn Curtiss would design aviation's most ambitious aircraft yet. By late 1913, Glenn Curtiss had become a leading figure in American aviation and the largest aircraft manufacturer in the United States. The factory at Hammondsport was inundated with demands for his latest aircraft, the flying boat. Aviation pioneer welcomed automobile pioneer that year as Henry Ford paid a visit to see Curtiss's newest machine. The U.S. Navy began accepting its first flying boats, which would soon go into war during the Mexican hostilities of 1914. In April, one would fly over Mexico in search of enemy troops, marking the first American operational flight against belligerent forces. While across the Atlantic Ocean, Curtiss flying boats were selling rapidly to European powers, hastily preparing for the coming of World War I. In the meantime, the flying boat was becoming a popular aircraft within American aviation. The U.S. government used it for foreign airmail service, and the very first airline was established with a flying boat between St. Petersburg and Tampa, Florida in 1914. The advantages of an aircraft that could operate free of an airstrip had clearly caught on. In April of 1913, a wealthy British publisher offered £10,000 to the first person to fly across the Atlantic Ocean from the United States or Canada to any point in England or Ireland in 72 consecutive hours. By December, a wealthy American, Rodman Wanamaker, secretly agreed with Curtiss to finance the design and construction of a transatlantic flying boat. If anyone could do it, he thought, Glenn Curtiss could. By that time, a skilled British pilot by the name of John Cyril Port had become closely associated with Curtiss and his flying boat developments. The Curtiss Wanamaker Transatlantic Flyer was named America, and two pilots were chosen, John C. Port and the Navy's Lieutenant John Towers, one English, the other American, part of Wanamaker's plan to join the U.S. and Great Britain by air, commemorating 100 years of peace and friendship between the two countries. On June 21, 1914, the huge aircraft was ready for its first flight test. Lieutenant Towers had since been called away by the Navy and was replaced by George Hallett, a skilled pilot and gifted mechanic. Catherine Masson, a local vintner's daughter, prepared to christen the America at the edge of Keuka Lake, where the town of Hammondsport had gathered to honor its most illustrious son. Powered by two 90-horsepower pusher-type OX-5 engines, the huge flying boat was one of the largest aircraft of its day. The upper and lower wings spanned 72 and 46 feet, respectively. The hull measured 32 feet long and 4 feet across at its widest point. Curtiss, Hallett, and Port all flew the America with great success. The first leg of the journey across the Atlantic would be the longest, 1,200 miles between Newfoundland and the Azores, a small group of islands off the coast of Portugal. After refueling, they would continue to Vigo, Spain, and then finally to Plymouth, England. The amount of fuel needed to reach the Azores would increase America's gross weight to 5,000 pounds. When they added this weight to the aircraft, it no longer could lift itself off the water. The flight was postponed until August. Curtiss decided to install a third tractor-type engine on the upper wing to help get the heavily laden aircraft into the air. The increased power solved the problem, but it created another one: excess fuel consumption by the additional engine. Aside from the mechanics, there was another challenge to consider: navigation. Aircraft instrumentation was extremely primitive. To find the Azores, they would have to rely on a sextant, a magnetic compass, and crude drift indicators. There was no radio. Information was to be provided by signal flags from passing ships, and if necessary, carrier pigeons would be used for communication from the aircraft.
The flight of the America across the Atlantic was about, I would say, in our lifetime, the same magnitude as the first time the people went to the moon. I mean, when Armstrong stepped on the moon. I think it's the same number of scientific stumbling blocks that they had to overcome in order to do it, mechanical and scientific.
Many considered such a transatlantic flight impossible. Curtiss, however, was completely sure of his design. By August 1914, he had begun reducing the structural weight of the America and was confident he had found a solution to the problem of the third engine. But before his theory could be proven, time had run out. While the transatlantic flight of the America had been intended to herald the peaceful use of the airways, the Atlantic Ocean itself was becoming a battleground. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm had grown tired of hearing that Britannia ruled the waves and began openly competing for naval supremacy. By August 4, 1914, Europe was plunged into World War I. The dream of crossing the Atlantic by air disappeared for the time being. The Great War was a bloody conflict, fought for the first time in two extremely different arenas. The close-packed slaughter of the trenches sharply contrasted with the free-form dogfights of the air. The airplane became the new weapon of modern warfare and was quickly recognized for its destructive power over the battlefield and over the sea. The sea, too, had a new weapon, one that was changing the face of naval warfare, the submarine. Lurking below the water's surface, the German U-boat became the scourge of Allied shipping. Hit-and-run attacks decimated vital supply lines, and surface Navy vessels were unable to track and destroy these stealthy and aggressive hunters. Above, however, the airplane offered the best vantage point from which to patrol the troubled waters off Europe's coastlines. What was needed was an aircraft that could operate from hastily prepared bases down any coastline. The flying boat was the obvious choice. But the Allies also needed flying boats with enough range to protect vulnerable shipping lanes from U-boat attacks. John Port knew of just such an aircraft. Having returned to England, he persuaded the British Admiralty to purchase the America and her sister ship from Glenn Curtis. The British were happy to have the large flying boats, now designated H-4s, and 62 additional aircraft were ordered. By March 1915, the total output of the Curtiss factory was earmarked for the Royal Navy, and the following year, Curtiss developed a new flying boat to replace the H-4. The H-12 was much larger, with a 92-foot wingspan and 46-foot long hull. Larger still was the H-16, whose improved hull was based on experimental work done by John Port at the Royal Naval Air Station in Felixstowe, England. Because of its great size, the H-16 could carry 4 230-pound bombs, and with its two 375-horsepower engines, it could fly 95 miles per hour with a maximum range of 370 miles. By 1917, unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic had finally driven the neutral United States to join the Allies against the Central Powers. President Woodrow Wilson had urged the American public to take a stand in the fight for world democracy, and on April 6th, Congress officially declared war on Germany. As the nation rallied around the flag, the U.S. military scrambled to mobilize its forces. On May 23rd, the 1st Aeronautical Detachment of the U.S. Navy, consisting of 7 officers and 122 enlisted men, sailed for France. They were the first organized American aviation unit sent to fight in Europe. Although ready for war, they were hampered by the fact that they had no American combat aircraft, and only 4 of the men were qualified pilots. Wasting no time, the commander negotiated with the French government to establish U.S. naval air stations on French soil. By September, 4 stations were established along the French coastline. In October, the Naval Air Station at Mouchy began training American pilots and mechanics in French flying boats. Before the war would end, 27 operational naval air stations would be based in France, England, Ireland, and Italy. Until U.S. combat aircraft could be sent abroad, however, Americans were obliged to fly French, British, and Italian flying boats. By 1918, Allied naval forces were feeling more secure in the knowledge that maritime patrol helped to discourage U-boat attacks. The flying boat had adapted well to Navy missions. Soon, the American war industry began producing aircraft for use by U.S. naval air stations overseas. The HS series, a new Curtiss flying boat, arrived in France to replace the French flying boats, still being used by American pilots. The HS-2L was powered by the newly designed Liberty engine of 400 horsepower. The HS-2L carried a 230-pound bomb under each wing and was a welcome addition to the Navy's air arm. Although no U.S. Navy aircraft were known to have destroyed an enemy submarine in World War I, at least 27 recorded attacks were made, and many resulted in serious damage. Thanks to the flying boat, many U-boats missed opportunities to destroy Allied shipping, often stealing below the water surface to avoid an aerial attack. Over 4,000 patrols were flown, 450 convoys escorted, and 100 tons of explosives were dropped on the enemy. Clearly, the flying boat had proven itself an effective and later indispensable weapon. The war to end all wars finally ended on November 11, 1918. 5 years had passed since Glenn Curtiss had tried to free his America from the waters of Keuka Lake. Once an instrument of peace, the America had become a weapon of war. U.S. naval aviation had grown from a handful of machines to over 2,000 aircraft. 1,800 were seaplanes, mostly flying boats. In that time, the flying boat had acquired a range and lifting capacity unimagined in 1914. It was time to take another crack at crossing the Atlantic. Despite the great strides made in the development of aircraft during World War I, the odds of successfully crossing the Atlantic had scarcely changed since Glenn Curtiss had first begun building his transatlantic flyer, the America. In 1919, Atlantic meteorology was non-existent, and radio direction finders had only a 15-mile range. Getting across the ocean was still a navigator's nightmare. Determined to be the first, however, the U.S. Navy was undaunted, for in May of that year, 3 Navy flying boats left Rockaway, New York, to conquer the uncharted airways of the North Atlantic. Glenn Curtiss had relocated his company's research activities to the flat farmland of Long Island as early as 1917, establishing the Curtiss Engineering Corporation in Garden City. Some of the brightest minds of the generation went to work for Curtiss, making the plant a hotbed of aeronautical research. The Curtiss family relocated as well, often taking the time to indulge in one of Glenn's favorite recreations. During World War I, big money poured into aviation. Wall Street financiers demanded companies hire staff well-trained in the science of aeronautics. Designers had to conduct formal studies in aerodynamics, such as stress analysis and lift characteristics. At the new research facility in Garden City, Curtiss and his designers worked feverishly to satisfy a request of the U.S. Navy. Ships crossing the Atlantic with aircraft bound for Europe were being lost to German U-boats. The Navy wanted an anti-submarine plane that could deliver itself overseas. In the Navy Curtiss series of flying boats, it got one. The NC series, nicknamed the Nancy, would effectively solve 2 problems at once.
They thought, why not deliver these anti-submarine planes by themselves? Why not let them fly over? And that's what really the basic idea of the NC-4 or NC boats was, to deliver them themselves. And so, but the war ended before they could do it, so then they said, well, let's fly them over anyway and be the first to fly across the pond.
end of the war had left the Nancy boats without a mission. It appeared as though their transatlantic capability would go untested. But this time, Curtis's dream of flying across the Atlantic did not fade away. Commander John Towers, now the Navy's senior aviator, seized the opportunity. The U.S. Navy, he proposed, must take advantage of the NC boat's unique capability. A successful crossing of the Atlantic would win national prestige and bolster America's aeronautical prowess. The decision was made. The NCs were now clearly bound for glory. The NC's upper wing stretched 126 feet, 54 feet wider than that of Curtis's original America, and it stood 24 feet in height. The tail boom assembly was designed to extend off the abbreviated hull in order to save weight, giving the entire aircraft an overall length of 68 feet. Never before had an aircraft of such dimensions been built in America. The first Nancy, NC-1, had performed well in flight tests, and Curtis had no doubt it could fly the distance to Europe. But as NC-2 and NC-3 were made ready, other competitors announced their intention to try for the prize. By April 1919, the race was on, and work on the NC-4 continued around the clock. They had chosen to power the enormous aircraft with the Liberty engine. The Liberty engine had revolutionized American aviation. 4 units were installed, each generating 400 horsepower. 2 were mounted in tandem on the center line, while the other 2 tractor types sat on either side. Finally, on the morning of May 8th, the giant flying boats were assembled at Rockaway Naval Air Station on Long Island. Only 3 of the original 4 would begin the journey. The NC-2 had been sacrificed to repair previously damaged parts of the NC-1. Commanding the NC-1 was Lieutenant Commander Pat Bellinger. John Towers, in charge of the entire mission, commanded the NC-3, and Lieutenant Commander Albert C. Reed was in command of the NC-4. Each crew boasted the finest talent of 1919 naval aviation. The Navy had planned well for this epic flight. Every precaution had been taken to give the NC crews the best chance of survival, for success was anything but certain. The chosen route was virtually the same as that planned by Curtis for the America 5 years earlier. They would fly from Newfoundland to Plymouth, England, by way of the Azores and Lisbon, Portugal. Ships would be stationed at 50-mile intervals along the route. As the planes passed over each vessel, the next station would be alerted to begin firing star shells. Like signposts, these vessels would help lead the navigators over the cold waters of the North Atlantic. After taxiing into Jamaica Bay, the pilots opened the throttles. Each Nancy rose on the step and lifted its 6-man crew into the air. As the Atlantic Ocean rolled impassively below, the Nancys soared into the open sky, where the trouble would begin. Both the NC-1 and NC-3 arrived in Trepassey Bay, Newfoundland, without incident. The NC-4, however, was nowhere in sight. Off the coast of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, the NC-4 had suffered engine problems and had no choice but to land in the open ocean. After taxiing all night, it finally reached Chatham Air Station and was promptly serviced. It finally arrived safely in Newfoundland on the 15th of May. Fortunately for the crew of the NC-4, inclement weather had kept the other Nancys and the competition at bay until conditions were suitable for flying. Reunited, the NC team started out from their mooring in Trepassey Bay on May 16th to begin their takeoff runs. Each was heavily laden with 1,800 gallons of fuel needed for the long haul to the Azores. The full capacity fuel load posed such a strain to the NC-3 that in order to get airborne, Excess weight had to be offloaded, including extra oil, water, the emergency radio, and finally, the chief engineer. From the start, the NC-4 had outpaced the others, but tried nevertheless to maintain a position behind the lead aircraft, NC-3. Twice, mid-air collisions were narrowly averted. From then on, the NC-4 continued independently toward the Azores, a solitary rock in the vast North Atlantic. 1,200 miles east of Newfoundland, the harbor at Ponta Delgada in the Azores offered a calm surface on which the NC boats had planned to land. Fate had not been so generous. Wrapped in fog and having strayed far off course, two of the NC boats reluctantly attempted to land in the open sea. The NC-3 suffered irreparable damage. The aircraft had skipped across two wave crests and smashed into a 20-foot swell. The sudden stop ruptured the hull and wrenched the center engine out of its mounts. The flight was over for Commander Towers. For nearly 2 days, the NC-3 drifted tail first toward the Azores. Crew members perched themselves on the wings to keep the derelict aircraft balanced above the crashing waves. Miraculously, they reached Ponta Delgada after covering 200 miles of ocean. The NC-1 suffered a similar fate in the open sea before a Greek steamer came to the rescue. Heavily battered, the NC-1 was lost to the Atlantic. John Towers, commander of the NC-3, had been chosen as one of the original pilots to fly the America, and it was he who had brought the NC project to its fruition. But the distinction of being the first to fly across the Atlantic had ultimately escaped him. At about the same time that Towers and the NC-3 had begun battling the Atlantic, the Naval Watch in the harbor of Horta responded to what sounded like the drone of engines. The NC-4 had done it. At 11:23 a.m. on May 17, 1919, Commander Albert Reed and his crew splashed down at Horta. The longest and most difficult leg of the journey was successfully completed. The Azores had been reached. Like its unlucky sister ships, however, the NC-4 had not flown without incident. Rain squalls, fog, and heavy turbulence had nearly turned the big flying boat into an uncontrollable beast. But with a little luck, a lot of skill, and dead reckoning, the NC-4 found the Azores after over 15 hours in the air. The welcome at Horta and later in Ponta Delgada was more than gratifying. There were congratulations, speeches, and 21-gun salutes. It was an emotional celebration, especially for the NC-4 crew and its outstanding commander, Albert C. Reed. The provincial life of Ponta Delgada was a simple reminder of how far aviation had come in just 16 years. Horse-drawn carts that still filled the streets of much of Europe in 1919 seemed so primitive compared to the technologically advanced NC-4. The flight to Lisbon and the final leg of the transatlantic journey to Plymouth, England, was completed without incident. In some ways, it had been anticlimactic, for the successful flight between Newfoundland and the Azores had been the true test of the aircraft's transatlantic capability. The landing in Plymouth, however, made it official. The NC-4 and its Navy airmen had been the first to conquer the Atlantic by air. And a Curtiss flying boat had carried them. In 1925, the U.S. Navy was at it again. Since the transatlantic flight of the NC-4, setting records for long-distance flying had become an ongoing challenge. This time, the test was a non-stop flight from California to Hawaii. Under the command of John Rogers, a PN-9, the Navy's latest flying boat, set out from San Francisco to conquer the 2,400-mile route. Rogers failed to cover the entire distance by air, but he did fly 1,841 miles non-stop, shattering all other endurance records. After a safe landing in the open sea, he then completed the journey by sailing 450 miles to Hawaii. This historic achievement further proved to the U.S. Navy that only the flying boat could offer the range necessary to establish air links between the United States and its Pacific holdings. For the next 2 decades, the flying boat would continue to dominate naval aviation and extend America's defense perimeter far out to sea.
Glenn Curtiss and Glider, Manhasset Bay, New York, September 1922. Plane builder Glenn Curtiss readies himself for something new in flying. Gliders have never taken off from water before this, but Curtiss has the courage to see if this one will.
The man who loved to tinker never gave up his love for flying, especially off water.
Towed by speedboat at 30 miles an hour, Curtiss lifts his glider from the water. 140 pounds of airship takes to the air in another first for flying.
Indeed, another first for the man of many firsts. Among his greatest contributions to the development of aviation, Glenn Curtiss would always consider the flying boat his crowning achievement.
I think the flying boat gave him the most satisfaction because it was his. I mean, now the Jenny, he called in engineers to help him design it. And in the early pushers, I think it was a continuation of their development from the AEA. But I think the flying boat, the early flying boats were his. And the dream was his for Wanamaker and also for the NC boats.
The transatlantic flight of the NC-4 foreshadowed the enormous potential these large seaplanes would offer to future transoceanic air travel. It was also the final triumph of Curtiss's illustrious career in designing aircraft. By 1920, technology had outpaced the tinker with an 8th grade education. And on July 23, 1930, Glenn Curtiss, the father of the flying boat, died. He was 52. Glenn Curtiss's legacy lives on. The small float plane survives as a reminder of a time when flying off water was in many cases the only way to fly. By the time Curtiss had passed away, the grandest flying boats ever designed were being built to bring commercial air service across the Atlantic Ocean. The age of the great flying boats would evoke a romance and nostalgia within aviation that has yet to be matched. Those who are too young to remember can still visit Hammondsport, where it all began. And if they're lucky, they might catch a seaplane ride off Keuka Lake, where Glenn Curtiss coaxed his first successful flying boat into the air.